As of now, 4 international airports frozen, over 300 flights grounded, more than 50,000 passengers trapped, an estimated $220 million wiped out in just 48 hours. This is not a delay. This is paralysis. Planes buried in snow, runways unusable, terminals turned into makeshift camps where people sleep on concrete floors with no food, no heat, and no answer. Not because of an act of God, but because a war economy has hollowed out everything that keeps civilian life functioning. What you're seeing in Moscow right now is not weather failure, it's state failure. Perhaps this is the cost of prioritizing missiles over maintenance and war declarations over human lives. When a government can no longer keep planes in the air or protect people in its own capital, something far deeper is breaking. Do you really believe this was caused by snow alone? Like this video, subscribe, and stay with us, because what just happened in Moscow is only the beginning.
What happened in Moscow does not appear to be an isolated incident. It was exposure. In recent years, Russia's civilian aviation system has been operating largely out of habit, not strength. Aging fleets, patched infrastructure, and emergency procedures treated as routine. The snowstorm did not break the system. It revealed how close to collapse it already was. Within a single operational cycle, Moscow's 4 main airports, Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, Vnukovo, and Zhukovsky, lost coordinated control. Runways closed faster than they could be cleared. Taxiways iced over. De-icing schedules collapsed. Aircraft were left stranded mid-rotation, unable to reposition or depart. By the end of the second day, flight monitoring data showed more than 300 flights disrupted, including over 40 outright cancellations and more than 260 long delays exceeding 6 to 12 hours. At least 90 aircraft were reported out of position, unable to return to scheduled routes. For major Russian carriers, each grounded narrow-body aircraft translated into losses of $1.5 to $2.5 million per day, while wide-body aircraft losses climbed beyond $4 million per day when international rotations failed. The financial impact escalated rapidly. Industry analysts estimate that Moscow's aviation paralysis erased $220 to $250 million in direct airline revenue within 48 hours, excluding downstream costs such as hotel compensation, refunds, crew overtime, and fuel burn during diversions. But snow alone does not explain this level of failure. The deeper issue is mechanical vulnerability. Russia's airport snow removal fleet relies heavily on Western-designed engines, hydraulics, sensors, and control systems. Since 2022, access to certified spare parts has collapsed. Maintenance crews now cannibalize equipment to keep a fraction of vehicles operational. Internal documents leaked to aviation unions suggest that up to 35 to 40% of runway support vehicles in the Moscow hub are operating beyond recommended service limits. When the snowfall intensified, machines failed faster than crews could compensate. De-icing fluids ran short, mechanical breakdowns multiplied, and there was no logistics chain left to replenish equipment at speed. Inside the terminals, the consequences were immediate and visible. Tens of thousands of passengers slept on concrete floors. Food services shut down. Sanitation systems failed. Videos showed overflowing trash, closed restrooms, and families wrapped in coats under flickering lights. Some passengers reported receiving 1 cup of water every several hours. Others reported no official updates for an entire day. This was not crisis management. It was improvisation under collapse. This is what happens when a state invests in missiles instead of maintenance. You don't see the decay until it suddenly traps tens of thousands of people. The airspace itself became unstable. Under Russia's defense protocols, even a single suspected drone sighting triggers immediate civilian airspace shutdowns. During the storm, multiple alerts, confirmed and unconfirmed, forced repeated closures. Aircraft already airborne were diverted, burning fuel at a cost of $10,000 to $15,000 per hour while awaiting clearance. Some sat on runways with engines running for 4 to 6 hours. Moscow handles roughly 40% of Russia's total passenger air traffic and nearly 50% of its air cargo throughput. When this hub stalls, the shockwave spreads nationwide. Regional flights were preemptively canceled, cargo shipments delayed. Time-sensitive deliveries, including medical supplies and electronics, were stranded. For airlines already operating under high interest rates, rising insurance costs, and shrinking fleets, this storm was not a disruption, it was a stress test. And Moscow failed it, publicly, visibly, and at the very center of power. This was not bad weather. It was a system reaching its limit. In Russia, civil aviation is not a convenience. It is connective tissue. The country spans 11 time zones, stretches more than 9,000 kilometers, and concentrates decision-making, finance, logistics, and command authority in one city. When Moscow's planes stop moving, the state's internal circulation slows almost immediately. Within 24 hours, domestic carriers began canceling regional routes preemptively. Flights to Siberia, the Far East, and the North Caucasus were cut not because of snow on those runways, but because aircraft and crews were trapped in Moscow. Aviation unions estimate that 1 in 3 regional flights scheduled through the capital failed to operate during the peak disruption window. That matters because air travel is how Russia governs itself. Senior officials shuttle weekly between Moscow and regional capitals. Inspectors, engineers, medical specialists, and crisis response teams move by air because rail takes days and roads become unreliable in winter. When planes stop, the center loses reach. Cargo delays compounded the damage. Moscow airports process roughly 45 to 50% of Russia's high-value air freight. Pharmaceuticals, electronics, precision components, and medical equipment stalled on tarmacs. Industry groups warned that even 48 to 72 hours of disruption could trigger production stoppages in sectors already running with minimal inventory buffers. Tourism and services followed. January is a restart month for business travel in Russia. Hotel occupancy in Moscow reportedly dropped 5 to 10% within days. Restaurants, transport services, and event venues lost bookings immediately. Analysts estimate short-term service sector losses at $80 to $120 million beyond airline revenue alone. But the political consequences cut deeper than economics. For 2 decades, the Kremlin sold a bargain: obedience in exchange for stability. The war would stay distant. Life in the capital would continue. Airports would function. Trains would run. Heat would flow. That illusion cracked on the terminal floor. When tens of thousands of people sleep under fluorescent lights with no food, no heat, and no information, propaganda loses altitude fast. Social media filled the gap the state left open. Videos spread faster than official statements. And the contrast was unavoidable. Billions for war, improvisation for civilians. Authoritarian systems depend on smooth logistics. When movement breaks, authority doesn't disappear, but it weakens. The aviation crisis also exposed a security paradox. Russia's air defense posture now prioritizes political symbols and military assets over civilian infrastructure. During the shutdown, suspected drone alerts, some later dismissed, forced repeated airspace closures. Civilian flights were grounded to protect the appearance of control. The cost was immense. Each diverted aircraft burned fuel worth $10,000 to $15,000 per hour. Each canceled rotation triggered mandatory passenger compensation under Russian law. Airlines estimate an additional $30 to $40 million in compliance costs layered on top of operational losses. And all of this hit an industry already fragile. Russia's commercial fleet averages 14 to 16 years in age. Access to certified spare parts remains restricted. Domestic aircraft production has not replaced Western models at scale. Aviation analysts now project a 10 to 15% contraction in passenger capacity by 2026 if current conditions persist. This is why the Moscow shutdown mattered. It wasn't snow, it wasn't drones, it was convergence, a war-first economy, sanctions-strained infrastructure, centralized power dependent on constant motion. When the planes stopped, the system didn't just pause, it revealed how little margin was left. The collapse of Moscow's air traffic was not just an infrastructure failure, it was a stress fracture in the architecture of Russian power. Civil aviation in Russia functions more than transport. Orders, oversight, personnel, money, and legitimacy all move faster than geography allows because planes exist. When planes stop, the state slows. When the state slows, control becomes conditional. Russia spans 11 time zones, yet governs as if distance does not matter. That illusion depends on air mobility. A flight from Moscow to Novosibirsk takes 4 hours. By rail, it takes 2 to 3 days. In winter, road travel can stretch to a week. When aviation collapses, Russia does not downshift. It disconnects. That disconnection has immediate consequences. Regional administrations rely on constant air links for approvals, audits, emergency coordination, and political signaling. When officials cannot reach Moscow, and Moscow cannot dispatch teams outward, local decision-making fills the vacuum. Not because regions want independence, but because delay becomes paralysis. This is how centralized systems erode, not through rebellion but through lag. The economic consequences deepen the damage. Moscow alone accounts for roughly 20% of Russia's GDP. It is the hub for finance, services, tourism, logistics, and corporate governance. Air traffic acts as the bloodstream of this ecosystem. When circulation stops, effects spread within hours. During the shutdown window, business travel collapsed. Meetings were canceled, contracts delayed. Cargo bottlenecks rippled into manufacturing. Delays in pharmaceuticals, electronics, and industrial components added fresh pressure to inflation, already estimated by independent economists at 18 to 20% in real terms. Even a short disruption added measurable strain to supply chains operating with minimal slack. Productivity suffered as well. Traffic congestion in Moscow reportedly stretched commutes by 6 to 8 hours in some corridors, as snow-clearing crews prioritized main avenues and pushed snow into side streets. Lost workdays, canceled deliveries, and disrupted services translated into daily economic losses estimated at $120 to $200 million across the metropolitan region alone. But the most dangerous consequence is psychological. For years, the Kremlin cultivated a narrative of invulnerability. War was distant. Sanctions were manageable. The capital was insulated. Airports symbolized normalcy, proof that Russia remained connected, modern, and functional. That image dissolved on terminal floors. When citizens see that the state cannot maintain basic transportation in its own capital, cannot keep people warm, informed, or moving, the credibility of authority erodes. Not dramatically, gradually. Cynicism replaces loyalty. Compliance becomes transactional. The aviation shutdown also exposed a strategic imbalance. With air defenses concentrated around political symbols and military assets, civilian infrastructure became collateral. A handful of suspected drone alerts, cheap, ambiguous, and disruptive, were enough to shut down a multi-billion-dollar aviation system without a single aircraft being shot down. That asymmetry matters. It shows how vulnerable Russia's civil systems are to low-cost disruption once redundancy is gone. And redundancy is gone. Years of war spending drained investment from civilian maintenance. Sanctions cut access to parts and expertise. Skilled personnel were reassigned or mobilized. What remained was a brittle system optimized for appearances, not resilience. When snow and security protocols collided, Moscow's air bridges snapped. This was not a one-off crisis. It was a preview of what happens when centralized power depends on continuous motion, but can no longer guarantee it. A preview of a state whose reach is shrinking not because it is attacked everywhere, but because it can no longer hold itself together. The planes will fly again, eventually. But the damage to confidence, connectivity, and control will not reset as easily. So this is where Moscow stands now. Not under attack from the outside, but strained from within. A capital that once symbolized control and continuity was brought to a halt by snow, sanctions, and a system with no margin left to absorb shock. The planes will eventually take off again, runways will be cleared, schedules rewritten, but the deeper question remains unanswered. How many more disruptions can this system survive before stoppages become the norm, not the exception? When air bridges fail, distance returns. When distance returns, central power weakens. And when confidence in basic governance erodes, it does not come back easily. What happened in Moscow was not just a transportation crisis. It was a warning, visible, measurable, and impossible to spin away. If this can happen in the capital, what happens next in the regions? That is the question Russia now has to confront.